Acts chapter 18. Now, what we have in our text this morning is the end of Paul's second missionary journey. And so, as we have seen in both, honestly, his first and to this part of this, his second missionary journey, is this constant back and forth of progress and then persecution. There would be progress as far as people getting saved, churches being established, and lives being changed, and obviously those are the highs of ministry, as it were. But then you've had the persecution side of it, where Paul has been stoned, he's been beaten, he's been whipped, he's been thrust out of most of the cities that he's gone to in these two missionary journeys, and then that led him to Corinth. And we talked about last week how in Corinth, kind of that same pattern was being followed, and that there has now been a church established right next door to the synagogue, and people are getting saved, and all that's been happening. And so Paul now was starting to get to the point where he expected the persecution to come, because to this point it always had. And so it was into that feeling, and Paul wrote to the Corinthians and said, I was with you in fear and trembling and weakness. And so it was into that feeling of desperation almost, that Jesus gives him this vision, and he tells him, don't be afraid. He said, I'm not going to let anybody hurt you here. And so this kind of sets up our text today, because with that promise then, that doesn't mean that there would not at least be an attempt at persecution. And so this is where we follow then here in chapter 18, verse number 12 is where we pick it up this morning. And so it says, and when Gallio was the deputy of Achaia, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, this fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law. Now stop right here. This is the same thing that has followed Paul everywhere, right? He's preached in the synagogues. Jews and Gentiles have gotten saved, and then unbelieving Jews, sometimes mixed with Gentiles, but more often than not, the unbelieving Jews were leading the persecution against Paul. Same thing happening here in Corinth. It's the unbelieving Jews. And so verse 4, it says, and when Paul was now about to open his mouth, Gallio said unto the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O you Jews, reason with it I should bear with you. But if it be a question of words and names and of your law, look you into it, for I will be no judge of such matters. And he drave them from the judgment seat. And it says, then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the chief of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. And Gallio cared for none of these things. And then we read, and Paul after this tarried there yet a good while, and then took his leave of the brethren, and he sailed thence into Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shorn his head in Cenchrea, for he had a vow. And he came to Ephesus, and he left them there, them being Aquila and Priscilla. But he himself and reasoned with the Jews. And when they desired him to tarry no longer time with them, he consented not, but bade them farewell, saying, I must by all means keep this feast that cometh in Jerusalem, but I will return again unto you, if God will. And he sailed from Ephesus. And when he had landed at Caesarea and gone up and saluted the church, he went down to Antioch. And after he had spent some time there, he departed and went all over the country of Galatia and Phrygia in order, strengthening all the disciples. So we'll stop right there this morning. Now, as I mentioned, after having now established himself and a church in Corinth, he was comforted, and we saw this last week, he was comforted in a number of ways. He was comforted by the fact that he had met Christians in Priscilla and Aquila. He was comforted by the fact that those Christians happened to have the same occupation as him, tent makers. He was comforted by the fact that people were getting saved and a church was established. He was comforted by the actual words of Jesus in this vision, coming to him and directly comforting him, telling him not to be fearful. And so after having been comforted in all these variety of ways, now the problems begin. And so what we see in this text then is not only the fulfillment of the promise that Jesus gave to Paul, saying, I'm not going to let anybody hurt you, but also the test of the faith of Paul. Because even though he did do exactly what he promised to Paul he would do, Paul was still taken by these Jews, dragged before Gallio in the judgment seat. And in the mind of Paul, he's probably thinking a million different things, He's having to rest upon the faith that Jesus said, this time's different. Right? This time, the things aren't going to happen as they had before, and yet, at that present situation, before Gallio speaks, everything seemed like it was happening as it had every time before. And so, had it not been for the promise of Jesus, he probably would have been whipped. He probably would have been beaten. He probably would have been imprisoned, or something of the like. And yet, God used this Gentile ruler in Gallio to spare Paul, and thus having even more time in the city of Corinth to establish and to have some stability, not only for himself, but for the people in Corinth. And then we'll see briefly here how he takes the gospel back to Asia Minor and reaching the people at Ephesus, briefly so, before finishing and then kicking off the third missionary journey. And so our text then begins here in verse 12 with this man Gallio. It says, and when Gallio was the deputy of Achaia, and remember, Corinth is the capital of the Roman province of Achaia, which is southern Greece. And so this man Gallio is there. Now Gallio, you might not know the name Gallio, but you probably have heard of his brother. His brother was the famous philosopher Seneca. If you know much of anything about Roman history, probably the name Seneca has popped up at some point or other. And Seneca, again, well known, he did a lot of things, but probably his philosophy is the thing he's most well known for. And Seneca himself was actually the tutor of Nero. And so this man Gallio was the brother of Seneca. And Gallio, or rather Seneca said about his brother Gallio, he said, no mortal is so pleasant to any person as Gallio is to everyone. And so Gallio had this reputation of kindness, gentleness, wisdom. And we see some of that on display here, but we also see some things that kind of push against that and maybe contradict that a little bit. And so we see kind of both sides of Gallio in our text this morning. And here he is said to be the deputy. You see that in verse 12, the deputy, and that the word deputy means proconsul. That's the Roman terminology there. And he was, historically speaking, this is exactly where Gallio was. Gallio in the years 51, 52, 53 A.D. was the proconsul of Achaia in Corinth. And so we know, again, historically, everything that we read here is backed up by history. And so what's interesting about that is not only do we have, historical evidence that, proves the Bible, which, as I always say, is nice when it happens, not necessary, but it is nice when it happens, but also it gives us a very strict timeline. So we know within a matter of a couple years the exact time that Paul was in Corinth in his second missionary journey. And so it's nice to be able to put that together like that. But it was during this particular time, where it says in verse 12, that the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat. Par for the course for Paul, right? This is what has happened to him almost everywhere he's gone. And so this new church that had been established in Corinth, remember last week, was meeting in the house of Crispus right next door to the synagogue. And so every week, the unbelieving Jews are passing by this church and seeing these people gathering to worship Jesus, whom they detest, right? And so this consternation that they felt was just growing and brewing within them every time they saw the house of Crispus. So it says that they unify in their desire here to come against Paul, against the man who started it. And so that which Paul feared was seemingly coming to pass. And so again, remember, Paul, as we stated at the beginning, Paul is in the city of Corinth fearful, weak, as he told the Corinthians, trembling. He was scared. I mean, again, it makes sense. If we had experienced all the things that Paul had experienced, and now it seems as if things are ramping up for, round 20 at this point, right? He's fearful. He doesn't want to go through all that. Now, we talked last week how even though Paul willingly endured all of these things for the cause of Christ, doesn't mean that he liked it. It doesn't mean that he had to look forward to all the persecution that he endured and that he suffered. Willingly endured it. That's not the same thing. And so here he's, perhaps starting to get a little fearful again. And so this time, however, things were a little bit different. He had a promise of Christ. And so this is Jesus testing the faith of Paul, which God does. He tests our faith. And so sometimes we might be in situations as a result of possible sinful decisions or things that we made. Sometimes perhaps we've been put into a situation for no other reason to test our faith. Well, here that's exactly what's happening to Paul. And so he had been grabbed by the Jews, thrust before the proconsul Gallio, which, by the way, This will be come into play more in a second. But every time Paul had been, thrust before a judge prior to this, it was always a lesser judge, a city local magistrate. Well, now this is big time. Now he's not just before a local magistrate. Now he's before a proconsul. This man is in charge of a large swath of the Roman Empire. This man holds significantly more weight than any person from whom Paul has stood before to this point. And so this is a serious testing of Paul's faith. And so the text tells us the Jews take him, they bring him to the judgment seat. Well, we know, again, historically speaking, that these seats existed. They would be raised on a large platform, and the proconsul would sit there, and he would try various cases. And so, again, what we see here is a push from the Jewish people to silence the preaching of the gospel, which is what they wanted. It wasn't necessarily that they hated Paul. They hated his message. And they wanted that message to be silenced. We don't want Paul to just be quiet here. We don't want anybody ever hearing this message ever again. And that's what they've been trying to do in all these other places. That's why the Jews here take him to Gallio and not the local magistrates of Corinth. Because it's not just that we want it silenced here. We don't want this message taught anywhere. And so, like I mentioned earlier, this was significant because of who Gallio was. Not just his brother, but just his position as proconsul of Achaia. Essentially, whatever verdict Gallio would make over this particular case would hold weight with other provinces. And so they could look to this particular case as a sort of precedent. There would be a law precedent established by what Gallio said in this particular case regarding the growth and sanctity of Christianity within the Roman Empire. And so after this, anytime somebody stood before a judge in Rome for the purposes of being tried as a Christian for Christian beliefs, which is what was happening here, they will be able to look back to this and say, well, what did Gallio say? We know he tried something like this. And so there will be a precedent established by what Gallio determined in this particular case. Now, we see in verse 13, and I'll say this up front, there's a couple of places in the text that we're going to talk about today where we just kind of have to make some informed guesses. Some things are not as clear as we might want them to be, but as always, anytime we come across a text like this, we have the information we need to have, right? And so this is what we go off of. And so verse 13, this fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law. So that's what they say, contrary to the law. And so that leads us to ask the question, to what law are they referencing? I mean, here they are standing before a Roman proconsul saying they're breaking the law. And so obviously when they say that, they're not saying he's broken Jewish law. They're saying he's broken Roman law. That's why we brought him to you. Right? And so it is debated then exactly what law they were talking about. However, I think there's strong possibility that this is what it's in reference to. We have various historical writings that tell us that Judaism was protected under Roman law by a statute referred to as religio licita. Religio licita, which was a Roman statute that basically said this is an approved or a permitted religion. Not necessarily saying everybody has to be this religion, but it just says under Roman law, this was an approved religion. They could not be tried for their particular religious beliefs. It was protected under Roman law. And so Judaism was protected under religio licita. At this particular point in time, and really until the time of Nero, everybody in Rome essentially considered Christianity to be a sect within Judaism. And so Christianity was not a distinct religion. Christianity was just a group of Jews disagreeing over Jewish doctrine. Okay, and so that's kind of how Christianity was viewed. Eventually Nero would come along and he would start kind of making distinctions and blaming Christians for certain things, and that's a whole other story. But at this particular time, they were kind of seen as one and the same. Well, interestingly enough, we have the Jews here bringing Paul, and again, what we assume to be true here is basically saying Christianity is not Judaism. Now, here's the thing. They're right. It's not. It's not the same thing. We're not just a different branch of Judaism. We are distinct from Judaism. But nobody saw it that way. And so probably, again, more than likely what they're saying is, since they are not Jews, since they are not a part of Judaism, they should not have protections under the religio licita. Okay, and so this seems to be what they're claiming. In other words, if they're practicing an unprotected religion, and then we can then prove that by the things that they teach, which is to worship God alone, which for Rome means no Caesar worship, if we can prove that they're not Jews and that they're teaching things that are contrary to Roman law, then we can get them shut down. Okay, and that seems to be what they're trying to do. And so as Paul stands there before Gallio, we then see the promise of Christ be fulfilled and come to fruition. And this is such an amazing thing. Verse 14. And when Paul was now about to open his mouth, Gallio responds. It doesn't even give Paul the chance to say anything. And so Paul here is prepared to defend himself, just like he's done everywhere else. Now, we don't know what Paul's going to say. Perhaps he was going to give a defense of the gospel. Perhaps he's going to appeal to his Roman citizenship, which he does later. We don't know what he was going to do. Paul was about to do something. But before he was able to do anything, Gallio cuts him off and never even gives him the chance to speak. Why? Not because Gallio cared for Christians, but because Jesus had given him a promise. And Paul stood there, and he accepted that promise by faith, and Jesus took over the matter. And in the mouth of this unsaved Gentile, he protected the man of God. And that's exactly what we see happen in this particular text. And so Gallio tells the Jews that brought Paul, he said, if it were a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O you Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. But if it be a question of words and names and of your law, look you to it, for I will be no judge of such matters. And so essentially, Gallio sees this as an internal Jewish matter. Again, he, like all the other Romans, just see the Christians as another sect of Judaism. And so essentially what he sees is two different sects of the same religion arguing amongst themselves over which one was right. And so he says, I'm not going to step into that. I as the proconsul of Achaia, am not concerned with the matters of your particular doctrine and your law. And so he says, I'm not concerned with questions of words and names. So you think there's another Messiah, you think the Messiah is Jesus, deal with it amongst yourselves. I don't care about this. This is essentially what Gallio is saying. So look you to it. I will be no judge of such matters. And so he doesn't see this as two different religious groups. He sees this as one with interwarring going on. And so the way he sees it, Jews are disagreeing amongst themselves about who their Messiah is and what their laws should be. And so whatever Paul was doing was not illegal. Right? That's what he says. He says, if there was some wrong or wicked lewdness done, sure, I would listen. But he has done nothing illegal, and all he's done is disagree with your particular sect of Judaism. And that's basically what Gallio was saying. And now, again, go back to what I said earlier. This is a momentous verdict. A momentous verdict. Because essentially, it sets a precedent that Christianity was legal. Now get this. It doesn't necessarily make Christianity an officially recognized religion. He's not saying Christianity is now under the protections of the religious licito, but they are a legal religion. And so it showed that it was compatible with Roman law. That's essentially what he's saying. You can be a Christian and a Roman, and things are going to be fine. We don't have to start getting all the Christians and arresting them just because they're Christians. No, you can be a Christian and a Roman. It's legal. And that was a tremendously huge thing for the Christians, because if Gallio had sided with the Jews and said, no, you're right, they shouldn't be protected, then things were going to start to happen basically like they were before Paul was converted. Christians were going to be round up. They were going to be thrown into prison. The gospel that had free reign at this particular point was going to be hindered to a degree. Never totally. Christ is going to build his church. But there would be a tremendous hindrance put upon Christianity at this very new and young stage of the church. God was working so that his church could grow. This is Christ building his church. That's what's happening in our text. He said, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevent it. And again, he used the mouth of a Gentile pagan to do it in this particular case. And so, seeing this as a Jewish matter and not a Roman one, Gallio dismisses the case. It says, and he drave them from the judgment seat. Now, by the fact that he had to literally drive them away, probably suggests to us that the Jews who were there really pushed back on this. Maybe even started, a rioting to a degree. And Gallio probably had to call in his lictors, his soldiers, to drive away the people. But what I want you to see about this is that Paul won without even having to open his mouth. He didn't have to say a word. And yet Paul gained the victory. Why? Because Paul was so great? Because his reputation was so large? No, it had nothing to do with Paul. But because of how great Jesus is, and how powerful he is, and how sovereign Christ is over his creation. Gallio only had the power to do to Paul what Christ gave him the power to do. He could not go beyond it. And so this was Christ's victory. It wasn't Paul's victory. And so Christ had spared him the pain and the agony of the things that he had faced prior to this. And he gave him a year and a half. We see in verse 11, and he continued there a year and 6 months. And then in verse 18, after this, it says, and Paul after this tarried there yet a good while. We don't know exactly how long he was in Corinth, but he was there far longer, seemingly, than he was there anywhere prior to this. Christ gave him at least a year and a half, but a year and a half plus, we could see, of freedom to build a church there in the city of Corinth. And I got to tell you, the city of Corinth needed that maybe more than any other city they'd gone to. And you can see that with the letters that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, with all the problems that they had, right? They needed a strong Christian witness to remain with them there, to teach them, to help them grow, to disciple them in the things of Christ. Now, after the verdict was handed down, and this is a curious verse, one that I'm talking about. We just don't have all the information here, but verse 17, it says, then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat, and Gallio cared for none of those things. We don't have a whole lot of information here. So there's a lot of questions that arise from this. Who are the Greeks being referenced? It just says all the Greeks took him. Who are the Greeks being referenced? Why did they take this man Sosthenes and beat him? We're not told. Who exactly is Sosthenes? We know he's the chief ruler of the synagogue, but there's some people who think he was maybe a Christian. And working in conjunction with another man. Or another question, why did Gallio essentially look the other way? These people are beating this man, and he doesn't care at all. Why? Well, we don't know. We don't know. Sosthenes here is said to be the chief ruler of the synagogue. And so likely what happened, you see that in verse 8. It says, and Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed. So likely what happened is that Crispus, the man who was the chief ruler before, and then stepped away from being the chief ruler, and this man Sosthenes took over the position after Crispus believed. Again, that's our assumption on this, but I think it's a safe one. Now, in 1 Corinthians 1, verse 1, Paul writes to the Corinthians, Paul, called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ through the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother. Now, a lot of people obviously think this is the same man, and it very well could be. But the name Sosthenes at this time and in this place was a very common name. So it's possible that these are two different men. Again, we don't know. And so ultimately, we can't say who exactly was beating him or why they did. Now, many speculate, and I think that there's maybe something to this, but it is just speculation. Many speculate that the crowd became emboldened and essentially an anti-Semitic feeling, which at this particular time in the Roman Empire was growing. Now, remember, it was not that long after Claudius had expelled all the Jews from Rome. So there was at least a growing anti-Semitic tide in the Roman Empire. I'm not saying that's exactly what's happening here, but we know historically those things did take place. And so a lot of people think that there was this crowd, this Gentile crowd, they're watching this, got emboldened by Gallio essentially shutting down the Jews, and got emboldened in their anti-Semitic feeling, and so they take Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue, and begin to beat him. Maybe that's true. Again, we just don't know. That's we can't say with any certainty because the text doesn't tell us. But I want to quote Darrell Bock here. I agree with the kind of summary of this particular story. He says, the account as a whole shows that Rome is going to stay out of the dispute if possible. It will not rule for Christianity or against it. There is no real interest in Jewish affairs. And I think we do see that, even in the story with Sosthenes, right? Jewish people, you just go do what you do. You're protected. Just don't bother us, right? Again, what is Rome's whole thing? Keep the peace, right? That's always what they want to do. They want to keep the peace. And so they're just going to be hands off in this regard. And so a momentous victory was won legislatively for the cause of Christ and the new church. And then we move beyond that. Verse 18, it says, and Paul after this tarried there yet a good while. Again, we don't know how long, but long enough the Bible calls it a good while. And then he took his leave of the brethren, and he sailed thence into Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila, having shorn his head in Cenchrea, for he had a vow. And so as Paul leaves for Syria, which is where Antioch is, his sending church, as Paul leaves for Syria, he goes to Cenchrea. And so, as I told you, Corinth was on a land bridge between Achaia and mainland Greece. And so Achaia was a small peninsula to the south of Greece, and there was a small land bridge that connected mainland Greece with Achaia. And Corinth was on one side of that land bridge, and Cenchrea was on the other side. And so essentially, if somebody were going to be sailing west, they would leave from Corinth. If somebody was going to be sailing east, they would go down to Cenchrea, and they would leave from Cenchrea. And so Cenchrea was essentially the eastern port of Corinth. And so that's where Paul goes because he's going east. And so he goes down to Cenchrea, and he leaves, brings with him Priscilla and Aquila, the two Christians that he met there in Corinth, which is another in a long line of godly people Paul saw as valuable for his ministry. And this is something that's an amazing aspect of Paul that I think often goes overlooked, is that Paul found godly people everywhere he went and saw their usefulness and attached himself to them. And he was like, basically he said, I can see how useful you are for God. Those are the kind of people I want around me. And so Paul was constantly picking up people. He picked up Luke. He picked up Timothy. He picked up Silas. He picked up all these others. Now he picks up Aquila and Priscilla, and he brings them with it and basically says, listen, God's going to use you, so just grab a hold, and we're going to go forward. Right? And that's essentially what it does with them. And he takes them down to Ephesus, and he leaves them there. Now, he leaves them there probably because he knows, I don't have long to stay, but they're godly Christian people and kind of can help matters as I leave. And that's exactly what they do. We'll see that later on. But here in Cenchrea, again, another question. In Cenchrea, we read that Paul cut his hair for he had a vow. I read so much about this vow, so many different beliefs about this vow, so many people with various opinions about this vow. And I just kind of sat back at one point and just kind of almost chuckled to myself thinking, there's been so much said about this, and we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. All it says is that Paul had a vow. That's all it says. Is this a Nazirite vow? It very well could be, but we're not told it's a Nazirite. Now, a lot of people just automatically assume it's a Nazirite vow because he cut his hair. And as we know from the Old Testament, the sign of the end of a Nazirite vow was to cut your hair. So is this a Nazirite vow? Very possibly. It very well could be. But it also says that he cut his hair for he had a vow. That doesn't necessarily mean that this is the beginning or the end of it. Right? This very well could be the beginning of the vow. We're not told. Right? And so, again, we don't know. So a lot of people think this is a Nazirite vow. A lot of people think this was just a personal vow made by Paul, unrelated to any Jewish law. A lot of people come to this and they think, they almost get angry at Paul because they assume that this is a Nazirite vow, and they think, why would Paul make a vow and place himself under Jewish law, seeing as he's the one preaching grace to all the Gentiles and saying we're free from the law? However, to make that statement misunderstands grace. Paul wasn't telling everybody, you got to do a vow. All he did is he took a vow. You have the grace to do so. So this is in keeping with his view of grace. You have the grace to take a vow. You have the grace not to. As long as you're not taking a vow and then telling everybody else, because I'm doing it, you got to do it too. Right? No, that's not what he did. And so whether this was a Nazirite vow or not, this is in no way infringing upon Paul's doctrine of grace. I'll say the biblical doctrine of grace and freedom. And so we could speculate all day, but again, that's all it would be. It would just be speculation. So what do I say about it? I'll say this. Paul shaved his head in Cenchrea because he had a vow. That's what he did, and that's what we know. What vow was it? We don't know. Why did he shave his head? We don't know. Shave his head meaning cut his hair, possibly shaved it bald. Again, whatever. We don't know. Paul had a vow. That's as far as we will go. Now, before going all the way to Syria, he makes a stop in Asia Minor. So just a little bit north of making all the way to the Syrian coast, he makes a stop in Asia Minor. And this is the Roman province of Asia, and specifically Asia Minor, an area of Asia. But he stops in the city of Ephesus. Now, this is his first time coming to Ephesus. Ephesus is a major, important city in the area of Asia Minor. It was the capital of the Roman province of Asia, and it was really a center of commerce in the entire region. It was large city, high population, and as we've seen very often, not every single time, but very often, Paul is very strategic in the cities that he goes to. He wants to make so that wherever he is establishing churches, those churches can establish churches. He's trying to do things so that the gospel gets as far and wide as possible. And so he stops here in Ephesus. Now we'll talk. I don't want to go into too much detail about Ephesus because he's going to come back to Ephesus in the next chapter, and we'll give a little bit more detail then. But here it says that he leaves Priscilla and Aquila there. Again, Paul knows at this particular point he's not staying long. And so he leaves this godly couple here to have a good godly witness after he's gone. And so they would help get the church established. They would host the church in their home. Paul, when he writes to the Corinthians, he writes to the Corinthians from the city of Ephesus. And he tells them, the churches of Asia salute you. Aquila and Priscilla salute you much in the Lord, with the church that is in their house. And so the church in Ephesus is eventually established in the home of Priscilla and Aquila. But it says about him, it says, but he himself entered into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. Now here we have proof that what he told the Jews in Corinth, which was, I'm leaving you and I'm going to go talk to the Gentiles now. I'm leaving the Jews behind. I'm shaking my garment of this. I'm wiping the dust off my feet. What we see when he told them that, as we mentioned then, was that that was a comment to the Jews specifically for Corinth. He wasn't saying, I'm never going to the Jews again. I'm not doing it in Corinth anymore. But nevertheless, he isn't in Ephesus long, and this time around he spends what little time he did have evangelizing in the synagogues, going back to what he knows best. Now, the reception in Ephesus was good. It says that the Jews there, they desired him to tarry longer time with them. They didn't want him to leave. All right, Paul, you've got to stay. Now, we're not necessarily told here that there were converts. I think we can assume that there was. But at the very least, the Jews here were interested enough in the things that Paul was teaching them and doing what he did everywhere else, reasoning with them from the Scriptures, because that's what Paul did. They were intrigued enough that they did not want him to leave. However, Paul had a desire to get to Jerusalem. And so as much as they wanted him to stay, it said he consented not, but bade them farewell, saying, I must by all means keep this feast that cometh in Jerusalem. Now, more than likely, the feast that he's talking about is Passover. And we're not told the exact reason why Paul so wanted to keep this Passover in Jerusalem. It may have something to do with the vow he made. It may not. But for whatever reason, Paul desperately wanted to get to Jerusalem for the next Passover. And so from Ephesus, there was really a small window of time for him to leave before sea travel would stop and shut down for the winter. And so, again, given what we know about the time that he was in Ephesus, he had just a little bit of time before he could get on a boat and make it to Jerusalem before having to wait the entirety of winter. And after getting through winter, sea travel wouldn't start until March the 10th of the following year, and Passover would have been just a few weeks after that. And so really, if he didn't leave now, he was not going to make it to Jerusalem for Passover. And so, Paul did, however, tell the Ephesians he would come back to them. And he does. We know that. And he spends a good amount of time there. Well, I won't get ahead of myself. We'll talk about that as we move farther in the book of Acts. But he tells them to come back if God will. This is such an important thing because this shows to us Paul's whole M.O. for his ministry. If God will could probably be the theme of Paul's ministry. If God wills it, I will suffer persecution. If God wills it, I'll live free. If God wills it, I'll go to Ephesus. If God wills it, I'll go to Athens. If God wills it, I will do it. That was kind of Paul's whole idea for his ministry. This is how Paul operates. He went where the Spirit moved him. Now it's not wrong to make plans. Right? It's not wrong to think ahead. It's not wrong to be organized. It's not wrong to make plans. It is wrong to make plans with no thought of the will of God. In other words, it is wrong to say, on such and such date, I'm going to do this, and I do not care whether God wants me to do it or not. Now, you might not actually say that out loud, but in your thoughts and in your intentions, that might be what you're doing. And so whenever we make plans, we have to have the thought in our head, if it is God's will, I will do this. And of course, we know that this is exactly what James tells us to do. In his epistle, he says, Go to now, you that say today or tomorrow we will go into such a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and get gain. He says, Whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away. He says, For that you ought to say, If the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. In other words, consider God in all that you do. consider God in everything you do. If you're making plans, just consider that maybe that's not what God wants you to do, and maybe those plans are going to change. And if it does, that's fine. We have to also understand, not only do we consider God in all that we do, consider that everything that God has for us is for our best. And sometimes what that means is the plans that we have made are not good plans. And the plans that we have made need to change. And so this is how Paul lived. This is how he ministered, if God will. How prideful of us to ever think that we are the one to determine our days. No, this is God's world, and we're just living in it. In conclusion this morning, Paul leaves Ephesus, and you see there in verse 22, and when he had landed in Caesarea and gone up and saluted the church, he went down to Antioch. Now, the word Jerusalem is not there, but that is what is intended by he went up. And so Jerusalem isn't specifically named in this particular text, but again, that's the whole reason he left Ephesus. And that's what, really, almost any time you see in the book of Acts, when it talks about going up, that's almost always in reference to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was on a hill. And so when it says going up, it's not talking about north necessarily. It's talking about elevation. And so Corinth, Caesarea, where he lands, is a seaport city. Obviously, Caesarea is sea level. Jerusalem, being on a hill, is at over 2,000 feet elevation. And so, when it says go up, it literally means up, not north, but up. He's going up to Jerusalem. And so he goes up to Jerusalem. He sees the church there. And again, you got to remember the book of Acts. And the early church kind of saw the church of Jerusalem as kind of the mother church, right? They were not Rome, interestingly enough, but Jerusalem was the mother church. And so Paul goes there, and of course that's where James, the brother of Jesus, is, and most of the apostles are there. And so he goes to Jerusalem, and he talks to them, he sees them. He leaves, he goes down, and he makes his way north to Antioch. And so going down in elevation, he goes to Antioch. And so Antioch, again, this is his sending church. This is the church that Paul is accountable to. These are the people for whom have been praying for him, the people who sent him out. And so he comes back to Antioch. Now, it doesn't specifically tell us here, but this is what he's done every time. He comes back and he gives a report, how things are going, the churches that have been started, what God's doing with the Jews and the Gentiles and the other parts of the world. And so he comes and he gives his report. And then interestingly enough, seemingly no break at all. Verse 23, and we'll end with this. It says, and after he had spent some time there, he departed. And he went over all the country of Galatia and Phrygia in order to strengthen and strengthen all the disciples. And so what does he do? He gets back, gives his report in Jerusalem and Antioch, and then immediately missionary trip number 3. He's almost, you sense Paul's almost restless. I can't be here long. I've got a calling. I've got to be where the people need me. Antioch is established. Antioch has elders. Antioch has men of God teaching and leading and discipling. What Paul says, what I need to do, I need to be out there where they haven't heard the gospel. I need to be out there establishing churches. There are vast areas of this empire and beyond that have never heard the gospel. And so he takes off and begins just the way as he did a second, visiting established churches to disciple and strengthen. He does that before he starts venturing off into new areas. And so ever on the move, in just a couple of verses, Luke covers 1,500 miles of Paul's travels. And it's almost like a blink in the eye, and Paul's there. But Paul had a heart that would not let him rest long. Let me quote John Phillips. He said, Paul's brief furlough was over. His restless spirit was under pressure. He had a burning message to preach. Now, others might get wrapped up in sports, but he was too busy running the race. Others might invest time and talent in making money, but he was determined to spend and be spent for Christ. Others might take their ease and be at rest, but he could only see the outstretched arms, the empty hearts, the longing souls, millions upon millions of people dying in their sins, never having heard once the joyful sound, Jesus saves. So he had to go. So I'll close by saying this. Now, we don't have Paul's ministry. God doesn't call everyone to do what Paul did. But God still calls, and he still has ministries. And so we may not have Paul's ministry, but we should have Paul's heart. We should have Paul's ministry that says, where God sends, I will go, if God will. So we might not have Paul's ministry, but we should have Paul's heart for the lost and the willingness to go and to do whatever the Spirit has for us to go and do. Let's pray. Lord, as always, we just